So we went no contact with my husband's family about 5 years ago, and there were two very interesting things that came out of it. The first was that I noticed my husband's mental health became much more stable. He wasn't getting the same kinds of swings of depression, huge anxious things happening, anxiety, panic attacks. He had massive emotional drops, and being out of contact with his parents helped him to level those so much. So that was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was how quickly everyone took sides on this issue. And it wasn't just my husband's family, it was my family. And that was interesting to observe. But I'll talk about my husband's family first. But within a very short time, my husband's brother and his grandmother found it necessary to contact us and to try to tell us that we were being ridiculous and mean by not having contact with my husband's parents anymore. They didn't really ask what had happened. Clearly they'd been told already. But they didn't ask us for why we had done that. They weren't interested in hearing whether there was another side to the story. They simply assumed that there was nothing that Brian's parents could do that would justify us refusing to be in touch with them anymore. It didn't matter to them to find out why. But we told them, we were very direct with my husband's brother, and said, they have been emotionally abusing us, they've been mentally abusing us, they've been abusive, they are manipulating us, and we've spoken to them about it, and we've made it very clear that we're not okay with it and it's damaging us, and they aren't willing to stop. And my husband's brother was not okay with our decision and decided not to be in touch with us either. His brother tried to reach out to us a few times and wanted to arrange a time to get together, and when it didn't work out the way he thought it should, he just went off and sulked and didn't care to keep trying to get in touch with us. So we moved on, and his grandmother reached out to us for so long, and it was always, you need to forgive, and you need to move forward, and you need to make changes. And it was always about how we needed to fix the situation. And so we just didn't respond. That was the kindest thing we could do, really. She wasn't interested in hearing what had happened from us. So I moved on. But what's interesting too is the response that my own family had to this. I found that there were two camps kind of that showed up when they found out we were no longer in contact with Brian's parents. And the first camp was the people who freaked out. And it's funny because us not being in touch with my husband's family doesn't impact my family at all. Like, we're married, and so we see both sides, but like my family wasn't all that connected to his side, and his family wasn't all that connected to my side. So like it didn't really impact anybody else. And yet there were people in my family, my parents, my grandparents, one of my siblings, who were seriously bothered and thought we were totally screwing this up by choosing to have no contact with my husband's parents, and told us so repeatedly and informed us that we were being unforgiving. After we shared with them the whole story, which I've shared here, there's a lot of details missing to shorten it for time's sake, but my family were members of it who freaked out about this. So when my husband and I went no contact with my husband's parents, it took me a long time to work through understanding why someone would deliberately choose to be cruel or unkind or unloving to their child, or to someone who they cared about. I hadn't been taught well that there are people who choose to do things selfishly simply because they are selfish. And that was a really hard realization to come to. I do my best to assume the best of people, and that's largely because I love God, and that's what I believe the Bible says we should do, is to assume the best of those that we love. But I hadn't been really well taught, and I hadn't picked up on very well the fact that the Bible also says that we're supposed to be wise and understanding and know what people are like. And that was a part of my faith upbringing that I did not really understand well. And so it was really hard for me to understand how someone who said they loved you could choose to be manipulative, how someone who claimed the name of being a Christian could choose to act in an unchristian-like manner on purpose, and then when confronted with it, insist that they weren't. I did not understand that kind of behavior. So I did a lot of research to try to understand what was going on here. And I know narcissism is a buzzword, and so I am not saying that there is a diagnosis that I can claim here. However, understanding the behavior traits of a narcissistic person, a person who is incredibly all about themselves and self-centered, understanding those personality traits and learning about family dynamics where a person is this way was key to me understanding what had happened in my husband's family. And so I'm not here to make a diagnosis or to say that that's what kind of person that my in-laws have that diagnosis, because I can't do that. I'm not a professional. What I can say is that reading stories of other narcissistic abuse survivors and other family dysfunction survivors was like watching a videotape of interactions I had had with my husband's parents. The language was the same. The situations were so often only slightly different in minor details. It really was like reading a playbook that his parents had read and were following, and that I didn't know existed until I read it. So I know, like I said, narcissism is a buzzword, but it's a buzzword because it helps so many of us make sense of experiences we've had that can't be explained any other way. We spent the last few years reframing. Reframing is when you look at things that have happened to you in the past, but you have new information, and so you reevaluate how you understood a situation. And it's been an incredibly long process and difficult, but very healing, because of course, having the hindsight of, oh, my in-laws are abusive and manipulative, now I could look back at their interactions and so many things that I had just blown off as, okay, they're having a bad day, or they didn't mean it that way, or I'm sure they weren't trying to be hurtful. There were so many of those things I had written off because I wanted them to be the people I believed them to be. I wanted them to be good, kind of people. And realizing that that wasn't who they wanted to be, and they were okay with taking advantage of other people in that way and being manipulative, helped me to see those situations in an accurate light. And so that work was hard and necessary, and it was a lot of grief. And yet it paid off, is the best way to put it, I guess, because there have been other situations since then where I've seen someone being manipulative, and because I've done the work to understand what happened, I have no difficulty recognizing it in the moment. And that's a tool that I've developed from understanding what happened there. How did our children respond to us going no contact with my husband's parents? It was really hard at first because they were little. My boys barely remember their grandparents on my husband's side. My girls, I think our oldest was about 7 when we went no contact, and the youngest was 3 or 4. So they have a few memories, but it was very hard for them at first to understand why they wouldn't be seeing their grandparents for who knows how long, and why we weren't seeing them anymore. And yet, over time, as we've processed through things, our girls have recounted situations where they were being abused by my in-laws. And there were situations where our children were not being taken care of appropriately, and where abuse was permitted to happen. And we've documented some of it because there was physical abuse, though not sexual abuse as far as we can tell. And so we've documented those with the proper authorities. Statute of limitations has passed as far as we know, but my point in this is sometimes people will say, well, your children will probably do that to you. And not only is that a really cruel thing to say and vindictive, but I don't think it's true. What our kids have learned, and as they're coming into teenagerhood now and starting to see how people act, is we're teaching them that if someone acts in a way that is a bully to them, they're allowed to take care of themselves and be safe and go somewhere safe. They don't have to stay. And that's a lesson it took me over 30 years to learn. But my kids already are starting to understand it. That being a Christian who loves Jesus does not mean that you have to put up with abuse, particularly from other people who say they're Christians.